But in your opinion, which is more familiar to the citizens of our culture? Which is easier for them to conceive of? The idea of consumers fighting over sale items at Walmart on Black Friday, or the idea of Christians grieving over the Son of God's death on Calvary on Good Friday? The idea of church fights coming to light, or the idea of churches fighting against spiritual darkness? The prosperity gospel, name it, claim it, frame it, or the gospel of Jesus Christ, deny self, take up cross, follow me? Which of these ideas are easier for our culture to conceive of? James chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. And I want to begin with our text, and I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. It's there in your app, or follow along in whatever translation you may have today. We would, I think, all benefit from looking there together. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Today's message, a wanted poster. The word of the Lord reads, "What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you?" The Word on the Street paraphrase puts it like this: you scrap among yourselves because you're at war with yourself. Verse 2, you want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. The Message puts that part of the text this way: you wouldn't think of just asking God for it, would you? And why not? Because you know you'd be asking for what you have no right to. You're spoiled children, each wanting your own way. So many times we would benefit from just bringing those wants to God, because when we bring them into the light of prayer, we quickly see how they are exposed as selfish, and our motivations are exposed as all about us. Verse 4, you adulterers. He's using covenant language here. You are being unfaithful to your God. Don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? Now remember, in these times, the word friend held much more significance than it does today. We have Facebook friends, and we have no idea who they are. But that's my friend. Friend was an intimate term, a strong relationship word. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again. If you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. I love the way the Voice puts it. You are adulterers. Don't you know that making friends with this corrupt world order is open aggression toward God? So anyone who aligns with this bogus world system is declaring war against the one true God. There it is. That's powerful. Verse 5, do you think the scriptures have no meaning? They say God is passionate, that the Spirit He has placed within us should be faithful to Him. I don't know how many of you have a long-time Church of God background, but years ago our denomination had a radio ministry. Now I'm a radio guy. I was a disc jockey, worked at a radio station for several years. And I've always loved listening to old-time radio programs. And so I think there's something amazing about the theater of the mind that television just can't compete with. And I loved our old radio program. It was a national program called Forward in Faith. How many of you remember Forward in Faith? Yeah. Had a lot of great speakers through the years. Had G.W. Lane, a great orator. Had Benny Triplett, one of our overseers here in Alabama. Loran Livingston, tremendous pastor in North Carolina. But I think the one that I connect with most, because he was there during my coming up generation and when I was starting my ministry, was a tremendous speaker, a dynamic communicator named Carl Richardson. I think he had a voice that was just born for radio. It was that good. And I remember as a kid listening to him speak and the churchmen sing, and Al Taylor, the announcer, with such a smooth voice. And it was a great program. And sometimes Susie and I were pastoring in remote regions, a long way from home, Pennsylvania or West Virginia. And there was just something familiar about his voice that made me feel like I was hearing from a friend. And I loved those programs, Forward in Faith. In fact, before internet and before YouTube, Al Taylor would say, if you would like a printed copy, a printed manuscript of today's message, you can order it. And I remember getting those in the mail. And I would get them, and they were already cut, they were already folded, they were already stapled, they were already hole punched, and they went into this folder that Forward in Faith provided for its listeners. And I still have some of those in my library. And I remember those messages. In fact, one of them, I think, stands out the most because of its title. It was a question. It was a great question. And sometimes a title can just capture your attention, and you almost have to hear what it's all about. The name of that message was, "What in the World is Worldliness?" I thought, what a great question. People are still asking it today. What in the world is worldliness? That title led me to some investigation this week, and I looked up some insights and definitions as I searched and researched the word worldliness. Vance Havner wrote this: worldliness is rampant in the church. The devil is not fighting churches, he is joining them. He isn't persecuting Christianity, he's professing it. Boy, it's true. It's been a strategy all along. When he could not destroy the church through persecution, because persecution only caused the church to be dispersed, and they went everywhere sharing the faith. So he infiltrated the church and diluted its message and compromised its conviction. A.W. Tozer wrote this: that this world is a playground instead of a battlefield has now been accepted and practiced by the vast majority of Christians. So true. Tozer also said this is powerful: it is scarcely possible in most places to get anyone to attend a meeting where the only attraction is God. What do you have to offer me that the church down the street can't compete with? Let me read that again. It is scarcely possible in most places to get anyone to attend a meeting where the only attraction is God, or I might even add the Word of God. John Blanchard wrote this: a man caught up with this world is not ready for the next one. I love what centuries ago Horatius Bonar wrote: I looked for the church and I found it in the world. I looked for the world and I found it in the church. Robert Leitner put it this way: worldliness is unfaithfulness to God, a sin against love. When Christians embrace the philosophy of this world, adopt the practices of the world, pursue the goals of the world, and assume the likeness of the world, they have sided with the world against Christ. These are powerful statements. William Secker wrote this: it is dangerous dressing for another world by the looking glass of this world, or by the mirror of this world. I love what David Shepard wrote. David Shepard said, it strikes me that some people want only as much of God's salvation, as will keep them out of hell. And they measure out with unconscious precision how much worldliness and sin they can still hang on to without jeopardizing their chances. Amen or oh me. I've got a book in my library that my grandfather gave me, a classic book by a great Church of God author, Charles W. Kahn, called Why Men Go Back. And in that book he writes this: modes, fashions, and customs are contemporary manifestations of worldliness. In the next generation, the expressions or manifestations may have entirely different forms, not dreamed of today. But the spirit of unholy conformity remains the same. A person is not worldly. A person is not worldly because he goes to worldly amusements or is worldly in his dress. It is the other way around. He does these things because he is worldly in his heart. The seat of the problem is in the heart and mind. Have you ever tried to tell somebody a story that you're so emotionally connected to, it's really hard to put it into words? And maybe it's even hard to express yourself because the emotions get in the way. So I wrote down these thoughts about something that happened, and I want to just read it to you. It's just a few paragraphs. About 40 years ago, a state bishop, state overseer, basically took away my church assignment and refused to give me another pastoral appointment. After several months of not hearing anything, I was finally able to sit down with him face to face and ask him the all-important question: why? Why? I'll never forget his answer. He said to me, "Your wife wears too much makeup." And then he asked me what I intended to do about it. I respectfully told him that I didn't agree with his assessment and that I liked the way my wife looked. He then said to me, "When I can watch your wife come in the back door of the tabernacle from my seat on the stage and recognize the red lipstick that she's wearing, then it's too much." Looking back, I realized that the problem was not my wife's lovely face, but that man's self-righteous heart. The worldliness wasn't in my wife's look, it was in his outlook. But Susie, on her own, even reduced the amount of cosmetics, which was very little, that she used. And I say on her own because I sure didn't ask her to do it. She demonstrated humility, though, and submission. I never saw 1 ounce of humility from that man. Now, I don't say that to criticize him. I don't name any names, but I say that to illustrate worldliness. Charles W. Kahn also wrote this. And in this definition, he shined a light on the fact that worldliness is more than something we put on or take off. Worldliness is a spirit in man, a spirit that conforms to the world in preference to the Spirit of God. It causes some to dress immodestly, others to seek unholy amusement, others to desire prominence, others to covet possessions, others to despise all who disagree with them, and still others to be timid about their Lord. All of these come from a spirit that conforms to this world, its standards, its customs, its nature, and affections. In many ways, this message is asking that same question Carl Richardson asked so many years ago: what in the world is worldliness? And in verses 5 and 6 and 7 of chapter 4, and even verse 4, he really defines it in a powerful way. Remember, he talked about friendship with the world, being an enemy with God. But the first thing I want to do is kind of review what we talked about last Sunday, symptoms of worldliness. Symptoms of worldliness. Number one, it affects our intrapersonal communication. Verse 1, remember this. What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war in your heart? Now, did you notice something? He said quarrels and fights. These problems were listed in the plural. Why? Because it wasn't a one-and-done situation. It was a chronic condition. They were fighting. They were quarreling with one another. They actually had drama in the New Testament church all the way back then. I love dramas in church. I remember the last church we were at, the first time we used a drama. Just a little 5-minute drama before the message. I'd gone to a pastoral conference and seen a lot of great dramas, and I thought, let's share that before the message. It's another way to communicate. And I remember one of the leading families in our church left the church. They just quit. And they own one of the main restaurants in town, so everybody knew about it. And I love this family, just a great family. But they didn't believe that that kind of thing had a place in church, drama of all things. And eventually they came back, and we were great and just loved them. And it just took some getting used to. But what really blows my mind is this drama thing isn't anything new. There was drama in the New Testament church, but they weren't scripted dramas, and they weren't play acting either. They were fighting each other because of what was going on inside of each one of them. Listen to the paraphrase of verse 1. The quarrels and fights among you come from the evil desires within you. The quarrels and fights among you come from the evil desires within you. That word desires comes from our English word hedonism. Hedonism has been called the Playboy philosophy. It's a philosophy that teaches that the real reason for living is to satisfy self. And you know, that fact might be strange or seem strange when we remember that James is writing to believers. Remember, he says over and over again, brothers, brothers, brothers. But in his commentary on James, Thomas Lee reminds us of an important truth. He writes this: these sinful desires lay within each Christian. All of us. Even believers find in themselves an alien army which seeks self rather than God. These desires express what? Our pre-Christian nature, still seeking to control our lives. Christians will never be freed from the evil influence of these subtle desires, but by God's grace we can escape their domination. J.C. Ryle once wrote this: let us never forget that our chief danger is from within. The world and the devil combined cannot do as much harm as our own hearts will if we don't watch and pray. So it affects our intrapersonal communication, our talking with ourselves. It affects, secondly, our interpersonal communication. I watched as we had fellowship time and people talked to one another and greeted one another. And that's kind of our image of church life. A family that feels a reunion each time we get together. And that's wonderful. But these wars that go on within us affect relationships outside of us. Verse 2a says, you want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. I titled this message A Wanted Poster because that's kind of what I saw when I looked here in verse 2. A wanted poster. But James wasn't writing about a wanted killer. He was writing about people who kill because of what they want. I want that. I want that. And some argue, wait a minute, that word murder there is hyperbole. It's literary exaggeration. He didn't really mean they murder, and that's certainly a possibility. In fact, a lot of scholars would agree with you. But we also remember Cain and Abel. We remember David and Uriah. We remember King Ahab, Jezebel, and Naboth. I want it. You got it. I must get it. But even if he's only talking about war that happens in our heart in verse 2, that still means in almost every church in America you could hang this wanted poster. In almost every home in America you could still put up a copy of this wanted poster. Let me ask you something. I wrote this as I thought about this verse. In your opinion, you don't have to answer out loud or raise your hand, but in your opinion, which is more familiar to the citizens of our culture? Which is easier for them to conceive of? The idea of consumers fighting over sale items at Walmart on Black Friday, or the idea of Christians grieving over the Son of God's death on Calvary on Good Friday? The idea of church fights coming to light, or the idea of churches fighting against spiritual darkness? The prosperity gospel, name it, claim it, frame it, or the gospel of Jesus Christ, deny self, take up cross, follow me? Which of these ideas are easier for our culture to conceive of? And finally, it doesn't just affect our interpersonal communication, it affects our spiritual communication. Notice what James wrote in the last part of verse 2 and in all of verse 3. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. The Message paraphrases this part of the text in such a way you cannot miss its meaning. Listen, you wouldn't think of just asking God for it, would you? And why not? Because you know you'd be asking for what you have no right to. You're spoiled children wanting your own way. You're spoiled children wanting your own way. Our kids are gone now. It's just me and Suze at the house most of the time. Unless we can convince them to bring the grandkids. And so sometimes I might be thinking about something to eat or something I need Susie to do for me, and I'll mention it to her, and she might say, well, I don't think I want to do that. I feel that. And I might say something back. And she'll say, what did you say? And I love the fact that I have learned a word in my old age. Nothing. Nothing. What did you say? Nothing. Bringing that statement, that question, that demand into the light made me realize, I better hush. And that's the way it is. That's the reason we don't pray about some of these things, because we realize, oh my, I am a spoiled child. Coming to God not as a holy father, but as a Santa Claus who is there to meet my every greed. I was writing this week, and I kind of started later on this poem, but I was still working on it this morning before church. And it may sound like that, but I call it The History of War. It's not as big as some of those books on the history of war, but it's just a poetic way to look at this text. And I want you to listen. To understand the meaning and the history of sin, we need to ask the questions, where and how did it begin? The first book of the Bible introduces A&E, not arts and entertainment, accident, emergency. No, these two letters represent a husband and a wife. The Lord created them, and they passed on the gift of life. There's A for Adam, E for Eve. By now, I'm sure you've guessed. They had two sons named Cain and Abel. Later, they had Seth. When God explained his rules, it seemed the couple both agreed. But when the devil lied to her, the woman was deceived. So Adam did what Eve had done without a real excuse. They bit into forbidden fruit, and then all hell broke loose. My multi-great-grandparents on my mom and daddy's side, They went from living naked to let's find somewhere to hide. Then Adam blamed his wife. That's something husbands do today. He even tried to blame the Lord for sending her his way. He knew she was a gift, flesh of his flesh, bone of his bone. But right then he was wishing God had left his rib alone. Then Eve, she blamed the serpent that old Beelzebub spoke through. She argued that he lied to her, so what's a girl to do? But down below excuses, underneath, it's all your fault. They weren't upset about committing sin, but getting caught. The devil told Grandmama something we all want to hear. I think he spoke right to her heart and not just in her ear. And through his question, with his lies, we know what Satan meant. He said to her, it's only right that you feel discontent. Yes, discontentment, in a word, the origin of sin. We want whatever we don't have. That's how it's always been. The source of our temptation can't be traced to someone else. The reason for our treason is an enemy called self. The woman was bamboozled, or at least it would appear, because the devil told her what he knew she'd like to hear. You have a right to be like God and do just as you please. That's how he wore her down and why she started wearing leaves. I don't know what Eve said to him, but Adam went along. Perhaps he thought, this feels so right, no way it can be wrong. They had a home in paradise. This couple had it all. And yet the search for satisfaction led to their downfall. And it appears this discontent was there in Adam's seed, because all of his descendants tested positive for greed. This greed gave birth to sin, which in the end gave birth to death. Cain murdered his own brother. Abel and not Seth. But Jesus' own half-brother wrote a word that's speaking still. James 4:2 says, you lust and do not have. That's why you kill. Some murder with their hands, but we all murder in our hearts. And deep inside our discontent, that's where the killing starts. We battle, yearn, desire, want. We even pray sometimes. Then get up off our knees and shout, now give me that, it's mine. Can you imagine chapter 3 of Genesis this way? While she was being tempted, what if Eve began to pray? Oh God, please let me eat this fruit. I'm sure it must taste sweet. Then God might say, you mean that fruit I told you not to eat? And that is how the want of man resists the will of God. We try to make the Lord obey the ones he made from sod. Our fight with self, not someone else, that's where it always starts. A civil war is being waged inside each human heart. Like Father Adam, Mother Eve, we lean into our lust until our every want and wish is turned into a must. Would you bow your heads with me?
We are so glad that you were here today with us to worship. I pray that something that you heard today will go with you this week, and remember that God loves you and we do too.